If only there were a device to allow me to put a pretty border around Robocop. Oh, there is! It's called the Super Game Boy.
The Nintendo Game Boy was designed as a portable, handheld video game console, but with such a massive library of awesome games, why limit yourself to the small Game Boy screen, when you can play these games on the largest television you can find using the Super Game Boy, the Game Boy adapter for the Super Nintendo. This is an extremely easy device to use. All you do is hold the Super Game Boy in your hand, insert a Game Boy game into the top of it and push it down firmly, and then insert the entire thing into the top of your Super Nintendo. And then you play the game. It's just that simple. There's no additional power cables or wires like the Sega 32X. And in general, if all of the connections are clean, it works well. But like any adapter, where you're plugging a game into an adapter into a console, you just want to make sure that all of the connections are clean.
Or else you'll get to experience this a lot. Love that sound.
The Super Game Boy is an easy and affordable way to play your entire Game Boy collection on any television that will work with your Super Nintendo. What about third-party consoles like the FC Twin? Well, the Super Game Boy works with it too. Yes, you can play Super RC Pro-Am on the Super Game Boy. It works well with the old school gray cartridges and the black ones, but it does not work with the fancy Game Boy Color games, and it will not play Game Boy Advance games. For these, you need the Game Boy player for the GameCube.
You could also just use the actual hardware, but don't take my word for it. It will tell you the same thing, with less sarcasm.
But enough yapping, let's take a look at some of the cool features and how the games play in the Super Game Boy.
It could not be simpler to get Game Boy games to work on your Super Nintendo. It's a plug-and-play piece of plastic. And provided that everything is clean, it works like a champ, allowing you to play your favorite old-school Game Boy games in high quality on a television. Don't expect them to be remastered into 16-bit high-definition graphics with surround sound, though. It's just effectively outputting and blowing up Game Boy games. But with the Super Game Boy, you can play them with a Super Nintendo controller. And you'll be amazed at how good some of these games actually sound. However, don't think that it will improve every game played on it. Street Fighter II and Castlevania Adventure in particular both suffer from some delay from the time that you push a button until something happens, which is amplified when it's on a larger screen. Some games may just work better on the smaller screen, but it's still cool to see them big. While others like Donkey Kong, Super RC Pro-Am, Metroid II, and Battle Arena Toshinden definitely benefit from being played on the Super Game Boy. Many games are actually optimized to be played on the Super Game Boy. Some, like Street Fighter II and Donkey Kong, have a Super Game Boy Game Pack logo on them. And you can obviously see the cool custom backgrounds in those games, as well as some additional colors in Donkey Kong. Other games don't take advantage of that whatsoever. Now there's some Game Boy games like R-Type DX which can be played on certain Game Boys like the Game Boy Advance SP in full color, but with the Super Game Boy you can't get the full color version of this game, just the black and white versions. And then the Game Boy Color games just, well, they tell you this. Damn it, because Frogger 2 is awesome. Yes, it's so cool to see some retro fabulous games like Star Wars played on a big TV. The Super Game Boy is the bomb, and 2 of these were donated to Classic Game Room, one from Andrew in Clairton, Pennsylvania, and the other from Frank in California. There's such a monstrous array of awesome Game Boy games to own that it seems like a crime to not have one of these unless you have the GameCube Game Boy adapter. But there's some slight differences in how the games are presented. The Super Game Boy allows you to do some crazy things like this. Changing colors, changing backgrounds, drawing on the screen itself. Kind of unnecessary, but probably way cool back in the day. The Super Game Boy itself is not unnecessary, though. In fact, it's one of those things you should have if you've got a massive Game Boy collection. So thanks again to Frank and Andrew, and to everyone for watching this Super Game Boy review.